be four of us here once again, talking about chapter 1. I have a question right off the bat, chapter 1. Why is Matthew first in the canon of the Old Testament? Why didn't it come out, Mark, Luke, John, Matthew, or some other order? Does it matter?
Primarily because Matthew was the most used. As I talked about in the introduction, it was the one that the church preferred because it was written by an actual apostle. Mark was not an apostle. Luke was not an apostle. John was, but I'll explain why John's thrown at the end later. But Matthew may or may not have used some of the other material because there's a lot to that. But, most people believe Peter helped dictate to Mark what he knew. So Mark's copy was sort of Peter's memories. Luke was more of a scholar himself, so he went and actually studied and interviewed people. And like the Christmas story, he most likely actually interviewed Mary, the mother of Jesus, to get that part of the story. But because Matthew was an actual apostle, there was an extra credibility to him, and they preferred his gospel. So they used his first and foremost, and then Mark was the most next used, and then Luke being the least used because he's not a Jew, not really connected to the apostles. They accepted it, but it wasn't their favorite. And so they put Matthew first because it was the most used. In reality, they probably would have put John next, but because Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar, they decided to organize them together because they sort of repeat each other. A lot of the stories you find in Matthew are repeated in Mark and Luke. And so there's this similarity back and forth. So then John, because he's a little bit different, his approach is different to the Gospels, they put him at the end just because he's sort of different. There was some argument to put John first and then Matthew, Mark, and Luke so that Luke and Acts can flow together. But the general preference on the order was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then John. Mostly it came down to the different famous theologians of the early church saying, this is the way we prefer it. And then they all got together and that's pretty much, we're all agreeing on how we prefer to put these in order. So let's go with that. There's the occasional guy who disagrees with us, but he's wrong.
All right. So starts off genealogy of Jesus the Messiah.
Go ahead, Larry.
I thought it was interesting. I thought it was interesting that you basically started out, like you said, as verse 1. And that's the big bulk of it, because I think an opening statement for any book is important. And I thought you really did a great job as far as introducing it just as an opening statement. And even before you really even got into the genealogy.
Yeah, Matthew definitely... when you study a lot of the Pauline epistles, it's always just him, sort of his introduction. You don't really know what the point of his book yet is until you get partway through chapter 1 normally. But with Matthew, he just puts it up right in front and center. He's like, this is what we're doing. This is what we're going to discuss. Now we're going to move on from this. And it's a little bit more Greek in style. That's the way they like to write. During this time period, the Greeks would open with like a thesis statement and then move on from there. And so it's Matthew just sort of presenting it to the world in that manner so that they can immediately see what he's saying. And then he moves on with proving that point.
Right. And the two big things here that you kind of expound that you develop here are the two covenants that he's driving toward, the Davidic covenant and the Abrahamic covenant. But what you don't say here is, what's a covenant?
It's a good one. So covenant is an Old Testament term. It's something where two parties would make an agreement, but it was more than just, we're going to go out to eat tomorrow. It was, I agree to do this, you agree to do that. And if one of us doesn't fulfill our duty, there is consequences on the line. A lot of times, a covenant was so important that if I didn't fulfill my end, you could come and kill me for it. It wasn't just oh yeah, sorry, I missed out. I didn't do what I was supposed to do. If I was making a covenant with, my neighbor, and I said, I'm going to build this fence, and I don't do it, and his cows get out and injure someone, I'm the one responsible for that. I would be executed for the murder that animal caused. So the covenant was very important process. And when we enter into biblical, to God's covenants, and the covenants God makes with Abraham and with David, or the other covenants he makes throughout Scripture, it's more often God making the covenant without human aid. There are times where he says things like to Saul, he says, if you obey me, I will give you an everlasting kingdom. I will let someone rule on your throne. Well, Saul doesn't obey, so God revokes and says, all right, you didn't carry your part of the deal. You're going to die, one. And two, your descendants are not going to sit on the throne because you didn't carry out your end of the deal. He basically comes and gives David that same covenant, but then he adds this caveat at the end that it doesn't matter whether or not you obey me and your descendants obey me. I will do this event, and it is something that is you cannot stop no matter what you do or don't do. But if you want to have a continual line, if your descendants want to continue to rule, then they will obey me. And they didn't, and that's why there is no king in Israel today. That's why from the Babylonian exile on, there has been no Davidic king, because they didn't fulfill their end of the covenant. But God had placed caveats in this covenant that were greater than what they could do. So God was making promises based strictly on his character that were important for all time. This is something that Paul expounds on a lot, and then also the book of Hebrews expounds on, as we saw some last year. The God's covenant with Abraham in particular was a covenant that Abraham could not affect. God said, this is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to do it. And I'm doing it because you've been faithful. But if you were to stop being faithful tomorrow, I would still fulfill my end of the deal. And I'm going to bring about an heir who will be the ruler of all the world, basically. But one who will bless the entire world is the way he puts it to Abraham. And it's something that throughout the Old Testament, we continue to struggle to grasp, like, what exactly God means by that. And so it's not until we get Jesus on the scene that we're suddenly like, oh, now looking back, I can understand that this prophecy was referencing how Jesus would do things, what he would do. But it was because God had made this covenant. I'll just stop for a second and say, when God made the covenant, irregardless of Abraham, if God broke his end of the covenant, if God did not do what he said, he was committing to no longer exist. And that is how important the covenant was. Like God saying, I will either no longer exist or I will fulfill my end of the covenant. Now, to Abraham and to David, they understood, well, God can't no longer exist. So that must mean he will fulfill his end of the covenant, which is what we find God doing. But it's this guarantee that because of the nature of God, because he is eternal, we know that this covenant must be completed. That God's promise would come to pass.
So it's really, 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 really big. I mean, he's making a big statement here.
It's like it's like a contract. Like you're going to sign a contract to buy a house or to do things, but it's bigger than that. It's not something you can back out of. Once you've entered a covenant, it's either, depending on the terms of the covenant, but it cannot just be broken lightly. It has to be fulfilled, whether it be between two humans or between God and a human. And obviously, when God steps in, things get a lot bigger than just, I'll protect you and you protect me.
Is there a reason why? Because you mentioned in there why David covenant was mentioned before Abraham's covenant, and the significance there.
To a Jew, the Abrahamic covenant would be considered the more important covenant. It was the foundation of the Jewish nation. It was the promise that they would exist. And so for them, if an average Jew was to write this, they would put Abraham first and then David. Because even though David's was important, it only really applied to him and his lineage, not to all Israelites. And so when Matthew turns it around and puts them in the opposite order, he's making a statement that they would catch pretty quickly, that he's not saying them in order. He's not saying the most important. He's saying this is the one that I consider the more important. And Jesus is fulfilling this one more than the Abrahamic covenant, because Abraham's covenant does affect more of Israel. There's elements of it that point to the Messiah, but the Davidic covenant was more important to the Messiah and to what he would be like and what he fulfills. And so he points to that. And as we go through the book of Matthew, you'll find most of the Old Testament passage he's referencing back to is not the blessings on Israel. He's going to be talking about the Messiah, who the Messiah is, what the Messiah is like. And so the Davidic covenant was particularly devoted to the Messiah. And that would then help them understand, all right, he's also fulfilling the Abrahamic covenant, the portions that are pointed to the Messiah, not necessarily the general portions that they would enjoy or they would look forward to. It's not the blessings of Israel, it's the Messiah and what he would do. So yeah, he put them out of order. And I think that for us, we're just like, whatever order you want to put it in, that's great. But to his readers, they would see that and say, oh, well, that's the less important one. Why would you put that one first? So they would notice that he's doing something a little different than what we would expect.
Right. And the only reason I brought it up was because I think it's important, especially for memorization, that people or the kids understand what they're memorizing. And I believe you're correct as far as that goes, understanding the meaning behind it, because I've seen, even in some of the quoting I've had recently, as far as that goes, that I've seen them interchange the two. And I think it's important to really understand there is a reason why. So.